In addition to views and functions, SQL Server provides system metadata through system stored procedures. In SQL Server, many administrative and informational activities can be performed by using system stored procedures. In this lesson, you will learn how to execute system stored procs to return information about the system. First, you will learn the fundamentals needed to execute any stored procedures, and then learn how to execute system stored procedures. And finally, we will see some of the common system stored procedures. First, let's see how to execute stored procedures. A stored procedure is a group of transact SQL statements compiled into a single execution plan and used over and over again. Invoking a stored procedure is a little different compared to views and functions. To invoke a view or a function, you can use the select statement or an expression. But to invoke a stored procedure, you need to use the execute command and provide the name of the stored procedure and its parameters if it uses any. For example, to invoke the system metadata procedure sp_databases, you can use the execute or exec, which is the shortcut for execute, and specify the stored procedure name, and this provides a list of databases on the server similar to the sys database catalog view. Some system stored procedures accept input parameters. To pass those parameters to a stored procedure, you can supply them in a comma-separated list after the name of the procedure. For example, to retrieve metadata about the user table customers, which is under the sales schema, you can call the system stored procedure sp_help, which takes the name of the object as a parameter. And if there are multiple parameters, you can list them in the same order in which they are defined in the procedure's definition, or you may provide name pairs of parameters and values. For example, in the third query that you see here, the parameters are passed with the parameter name and the value pair. Let's execute the queries that you see here and see what the results will look like. Let's open a new query and paste the queries that we just saw and click on Execute. And as you can see, the first query returned information about all the databases in the server, and the second query accepts sales.customers as parameter and returns detailed information about the customers table in the sales schema. The third query returns information about all the columns and tables that are under the sales schema. The parameters are separated using a comma. Like the system stored procedure sp_databases, the system catalog view sys databases also returns information about all the databases in the server. Let's compare the two and see what the results will look like. Let's do a simple select from sys.databases. Let's select these two queries and click on Execute. As you can see, the stored procedure doesn't return as many columns as the view. So when you are selecting objects to retrieve information, you need to compare the system catalog view to the stored procedure and decide which one to use. By using the view, you can sort and filter the result set, but with the stored procedure, you cannot do either. Now that you have learned the basics of executing any stored procedure, let's learn some more details about executing the system stored procedures. Most system stored procedures are marked with a sp_prefix. SQL Server stores the definition of system stored procedures in a hidden resource database. System stored procedures appear to be stored in each user and system database, but this is a logical view only. They are not copied into user databases, but rather accessible from them without specifying the resource database by name. To invoke a system stored procedure, always use the execute or exec commands. You need to include the sys schema name when invoking a system stored procedure, and also name each parameter and specify its appropriate data type. For example, to get the details about the customers table in the sales schema, you can invoke the sp_help stored procedure by using the exec as seen in this query and passing the Unicode parameter to the sp_help stored procedure. Microsoft SQL Server doesn't require the use of execute or exec to execute a stored procedure. For a single line batch, the only line is always the first line, hence without using the execute command, you can execute a stored procedure. But, for example, if you have two stored procedures that you are executing in a batch, and if you are not using the execute command to invoke the stored procedures, SQL Server will throw an error. Let's look at some examples. Let's remove this select query and remove the word exec from this stored procedures. Let's execute the first query and it will return the results without any issues. But when you invoke both of these queries in the same batch, it will throw an error. Let's click on execute and it returns a syntax error. So, it is always a best practice to use execute or exec commands to invoke stored procedures. Now let's see some of the common system stored procedures. SQL Server provides numerous system stored procedures, many of which perform administrative tasks. The list of metadata related procedures include general help stored procedures such as sp_help and sp_help language, as well as more specific procedures such as sp_tables and sp_columns. The catalog procedures can be used as an alternative to system catalog views and functions. For example, the sp_databases function lists all the databases in an instance of SQL Server just like the sysdatabases view. sp_tables returns a list of tables or views except synonyms, and sp_columns returns column information for the specified objects. Unlike system views, there is no option to select which columns to return or to filter the data using the where clause when you're using the system stored procedures. And that is why, in many cases, it is preferred to use catalog views and functions when compared to system stored procedures. So, in this lesson, we've seen how to execute system stored procedures and retrieve metadata information from them. In the next lesson, let's see what dynamic management objects are and how to query them to retrieve the same information. Dynamic management views and functions return server state information that can be used to monitor the health of a server instance, diagnose problems, and tune performance. These were introduced in SQL Server 2005 and are supported in all versions since then. These objects consolidate and standardize system metadata and state information into a consistent set of views and functions. Like system stored procedures, most of these system views and functions are intended for administrative and development work. However, they can also be used by reports and applications that need to return metadata. In this lesson, you will learn some of the uses of dynamic management objects, the different categories of them, and how to write queries that retrieve system metadata using the dynamic management views and functions. First, let's see what dynamic management views are. DMVs, or dynamic management views and functions, return server state information. There are two types of DMVs: server scoped and database scoped. The server scoped DMVs require view server state permission on the server, whereas the database scoped DMVs require view database state permission on the database. Although the dynamic management objects include the dynamic management functions, the objects are generally referred to as dynamic management views to avoid confusion with database management objects, which is an older SQL Server technology. And when using the dynamic management objects, you need to remember that the dynamic management views can be referenced in the T-SQL statements by using 2-part, 3-part, or 4-part names. But the dynamic management functions, on the other hand, can be referenced in the T-SQL statements by either using the 2-part or 3-part names. And both of the dynamic management views and functions cannot be referenced in the T-SQL statements by using 1-part names. Like system stored procedures, the definitions of DMVs are stored in the hidden resource database and appear logically in each database on a SQL Server instance. And these DMVs can be implemented as views or as table-valued functions. If a DMV is a view, it will not take parameters, but if it is a function, parameters may be required. Dynamic management views include catalog information as well as administrative status information such as object dependencies. There are nearly 200 DMVs in SQL Server 2012. Microsoft has adapted DMVs to address the changing functionality with each new version of SQL Server. Columns are added or dropped to reflect this. Their schemas and the data they return may change in the future releases of SQL Server. So it is advised to avoid writing select star queries against DMVs to avoid maintenance problems with the code in production. And this table here shows the number of DMVs in the various versions of SQL Server. Now let's see the different categories of DMVs. The name of the dynamic management view or function starts with DM_. and they all reside in sys schema. There is a naming convention that helps organize the DMVs by the function. After the DM underscore prefix, you will see a short descriptive portion of the name. This descriptor places the DMV into a functional category. For example, DB for database-related information, TRAN for transaction-related information, or exec for query execution-related metadata. Within each grouping, you will find one or more DMVs that provide detailed state or metadata information from the system. Now let's see how to retrieve information from a dynamic management view. To retrieve information from a DMV, you can use the select statement like you would use it on any other regular table, view, or table-valued function. And you can use the where clause to filter the data in a DMV. And like discussed, dynamic management views are queried like standard views. And in this example, the query returns a list of current user connections. The dynamic management functions are queried as table-valued functions, including parameters. And in this example, we are querying a table-valued dynamic management function called SQL referencing entities, which returns metadata about objects whose definitions reference the sales orders table. Let's execute these queries and see what the results will look like. Let's open a new query and paste the queries that we just saw and click on Execute. The first query returned the session information about all the open connections, and the second query returned information about all the columns that are referencing the sales orders table. Now let's write a simple select query to retrieve information about all the dynamic management objects that are in SQL Server. Let's do a select star from sys.allObjects where name is like DM underscore, and let's order it by name. Let's select this query and click on Execute, and it will list all the dynamic management objects that are accessible to you in SQL Server. So, now that we have learned how to use DMVs to retrieve metadata information, let's recap what we have learned so far in this module. We have learned how to write queries that retrieve system metadata information using system catalog views, information schema views, and system functions, how to execute system stored procedures, and how to write queries that retrieve metadata information using them, what the uses of dynamic management objects are, and how to write queries that retrieve metadata information using them. In the next module, you will learn how to query data with stored procedures, how to pass parameters to them, how to create simple stored procedures, and how to work with dynamic SQL.